Hey folks, David Stewart here. Hope you guys are having a great day. Let's talk a little bit more about Tolkien. I'm going to talk about something from the Silmarillion again. Before I get started, I'm sorry there hasn't been a ton of content lately. I had a major problem with my hearing that's made just doing content a lot more difficult. Not the best timing because I do have a new book that just came out on Friday, All Shafalda. So if you're interested in a classical 5-act tragedy but fantasy with some esoteric philosophy elements, as all of my books contain, please check that out. I think it's $9.99 for the paperback, $4.99 for the ebook. So what I want to talk about today with the Silmarillion is Aule, the smith, and the creation of the dwarves. So this is a contrast to some of the things that I've talked about before with Morgoth. So Morgoth has a will for his own sake and will for rule over others. And this is a big contrast to how Aule creates the dwarves. He creates the dwarves basically for good-intentioned reasons, even though it is in a way a not necessarily a rebellion against Eru, but a little bit of a subversion of his purposes. And yet Eru blesses the act because of the good intent behind it. So, here's a great picture of Aule fixing to smash the dwarves. I'll just read a short little section. Then Aule answered, "I did not desire such lordship," because Eru had asked him, they move when you think and then they stop when you stop thinking. Is that what you want? "I did not desire such lordship. I desire things other than I am, to love and to teach them, so that they too might perceive the beauty of Ea, which thou hast caused to be. For it seemed to me that there is great room in Arda for many things that might rejoice in it, yet it is for the most part empty still, and dumb. And in my impatience I have fallen into folly, yet the making of things is in my heart from my own making by thee. And the child of little understanding that makes a play of the deeds of his father may do so without thought of mockery, but because he is the son of his father. But what shall I do now, so that thou not be angry with me forever? As a child to his father, I offer thee these things, the work of the hands which thou hast made. Do with them what thou wilt. But should I not rather destroy the work of my presumption?" And so he takes up a hammer, and they shrink from it because Eru has given them a life of their own. He's basically blessed the act. And this is so different from what Morgoth does. And again, it expresses Tolkien's religious views. And there's actually a lot of background theology and Christian religion just in this little section of the work. Again, if you're not coming from that, if you're not raised Catholic or you're not very familiar with Catholic theology or Christianity in general, some of these things can seem odd or just they're not going to be as obvious to you. So the big one here is creating for the glory of God. This is something that is biblical, and it is something that goes all the way back to the Old Testament. God commands when they're making the ark, he says how it's going to be made, and that it's going to be made out of precious substances, crimson stuff, red stuff, and overlaid with gold, and it's going to be very beautiful. And here's the artisans that worked on the ark and the tabernacle, and here's the artisans that worked on the temple. So the finest quality art is made for the glory of God. That's something that goes way back in the tradition, and of course it's expressed in the church. You want the church to be beautiful, you want the church to exist for God's glory as the world exists for God's glory. So this is something that Aule mentions, is that I wanted to make things that were other than me to experience basically the glory of God's creation. This is one of the godly desires for man. So there's lots of debate as to why did God make people, but one of the most common explanations in traditional Christianity is that he desires communion with us, that God desires things other than himself to exist and to be with him, right? He actually desires our company, which is a little bit different than I think a lot of cosmologies and religious sentiments. So Aule is really expressing just a godly desire to create things other than yourself, to have things which are going to keep you company. That's part of the drive of procreation of human beings, but also a drive for creation in general. Remember, Tolkien has this idea of creation and subcreation, that he's creating this world Arda as a sub-creation, as in essence an imitation of God. Just as God makes a world, Tolkien makes stories. And I do this too because I'm a writer, right? So I make up, make-believe worlds, and I write stories about people that don't exist. But in one sense, they almost do exist because I've created them. And I've created them to exist for the purposes that I'm imagining there and what I want to communicate with the story. But in some cases, you can talk to authors that are like, it seems like the characters have a life of their own. Once you start to sketch them out and imagine them as people, then they start to want to act like people. They start to have motivations that become clear and understandable to you because they're like the motivations of real people. So this act is very, very different from Morgoth's act. And when Morgoth tries to create things other than himself to dominate them, not because he desires their companionship, but because he wants to dominate the wills of others, he can't make things. Instead, what he can create are kind of like homunculi and corruptions of real creation. So the orcs are made out of torturing the elves into this corrupt and ruined race of orcs and goblins. And dragons are made by presumably twisting beasts and growing them to immense size, but also placing within them evil spirits. This is apparent when you read, say, Children of Húrin, and you have Glaurung, the father of dragons, talk to Húrin. The evil spirit within him spoke. So this is kind of a reference to how dragons are created, that these are constructs made through evil means and not a thing which exists of its own life and its own will, but rather like a conjoining of corrupted and controlled things. And same thing, Balrogs were not made by Morgoth, rather they were Maiar spirits like Sauron that were corrupted to his service and became existing in the form of dark angels, fallen angels, beings of fire and shadow. So there's a big contrast here between creating for wicked reasons and attempting to make things other than yourself to dominate them, to own them, versus creating things from a godly perspective, which is to have things that are like to experience the glory of creation and things that are other than you. It's like having children. So it's the same sort of drive. So the creation, the desire to create other things is a procreative drive. And then the last thing is that he submits these things to Eru. He submits them to God. And this is a very, very old idea in general, that when you create something, you submit it for the glory of God, rather than saying it's mine and I'm just going to do it whatever I want with it. It's submitted as an offering to God. And even if it is imperfect, God does not look down on those offerings with anything other than love for his children, in essence. So Tolkien would probably never say that his works were perfect, because that surpasses human ability. But even someone, and this is something that you find in liturgical worship, is like an unworthy priest. Me, an unworthy priest. It's an acknowledgement that you aren't God, that you can't act like God, that you are a limited being. There's more to it, obviously, than just that, but in this context, it's kind of like that. So that when you offer something up to God, even if it's not a perfect creation, which it probably can't be because you are just a person, it's still approved of and it's still blessed. Bach created all kinds of music for the glory of God. And the fact that he spent his time making music rather than doing something else, and then submitting that to the glory of God, that's something that God approves of. And sometimes you get people who complain about nice churches. And this is addressed multiple times in the Bible, besides commanding people to make rich decorations for the ark, for example. There's also Judas, who says this money, when Jesus is being anointed before his death, this money could have fed the poor. And in the Gospel of John, he says Judas did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, and as the keeper of the money, he had his hands in everything. So, no, a church which is made to the glory of God is something that is an approved gift, that is something, an approved offering, not just a gift, but an offering. And so that's really the story of Aule. That's what it is that he has a spirit that is an imitation of God, and even if it's acting a little bit outside of the bounds of his authority, Eru still approves of it because of the good intention that he wants companionship, and he has a procreative drive, and he wants to do it for the glory of his creator rather than doing it to dominate. And as a result, it gets blessed. But there's always a warning that goes with it, which is, little love shall there be between thine and mine, the children of my adoption and the children of my choice. And that is a prophecy that the elves and the dwarves are not going to get along because of the differing natures of their creation. That the dwarves they're made with a memory from the music of what elves were going to be, but they're stunted, they're shorter, Iwali put his own desires into him and wanted to make a race that endured against the evil of Melkor in that time. So because of the difference in their intent of creation, they are quite like incompatible beings. But neither one of them is evil. The dwarves are never evil, and the elves are never evil despite doing evil things. They're not a race which is completely depraved or something like that, versus something like orcs, which I actually would say, there's hints that they're not completely depraved, but they are a very ruined race. They are a race full of beings that are going to tend towards evil. So anyway, leave me your thoughts down below about this element of Tolkien's work. I love it. It's a great contrast between the two different intents, intending to create and dominate versus being a sub-creator, doing something that is imitating the mind and the will of God which you come from. So anyway, leave me your thoughts down below. Newest book, which just came out Friday. It's called Allshaffalda. It's a fantasy book. It's a classic tragedy in 5 acts. It's got lots of tropes that I've talked about on this show, but executed in a way that I think you'll find original, including a deal with the devil. All tragedies, all deals with the devil are going to end in tragedy for the most part. Rarely do they end in tragedy for the devil, but you'll find out what you get when you go pick up this book. It's available on Amazon right now. Be linked down below in the description. Have a great one, and God bless you all.